Remember when the Nintendo Switch came out? Back then, the idea of having console quality 3D Mario and Zelda completely on the go was just wild. Like, that was incredible. But since then, a ton of systems like the Steam Deck and ROG Ally, among a billion others, have pushed what a portable system can do. And these days, so many years later, it's almost kind of easy to take the Nintendo Switch for granted. Yep, a lot of things have changed since 2017, but the more things change, the more the Switch has, well, it's kind of stayed the same in a lot of ways. So as the venerable Switch enters its twilight years, I wanted to take a look back at some of those things that in the heady early days I assumed for sure would change or get updated over the years, but didn't. It just stayed the same. Things that we might have to look to a new system, a new version of the Switch, perhaps a Super Switch, to finally get around to updating. First up, themes. Compared to the lavish presentation of the Wii, 3DS, and Wii U, the Switch's launcher is kind of brutally Spartan. No music here, no colors, no Miis wandering around. Nope, you get a line of squares and two options, light and dark. The 3DS started simple, but then grew to allow all kinds of colors, themes, folders, and more, so I assumed that the Switch would kind of evolve in the same way, but nope. We still get the same grid, the same fuzzy 720p resolution in dock mode, and no extra color options. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the simplicity, speed, and usability of the default Switch launcher, but there definitely is room for a little charm here. When the Switch came out, the paltry 32GB of built-in storage looked to be modular in teardowns, hinting at a future where Nintendo sold versions with radically more storage. The PS3 and PS4 eras saw consoles dramatically increase storage from beginning to end of their lifespan, but the default Switch is still 32GB today, with the OLED version getting a slight bump to 64GB, which both sizes are hilariously small when you consider how big modern game installs are. The reason why this probably never changed? MicroSD cards are very cheap and plentiful, so it's trivial to pop one in and add a freaking terabyte to your system. There was a time when browsing Nintendo's online shops felt as polished as anything else Nintendo did, filled with quirky music, cute designs, and curated lists. Heck, I used to just browse the 3DS and Wii U stores just for fun to see what might catch my eye. The Nintendo Switch eShop, by comparison, just feels like a mountain of shovelware that breaks at the slightest touch. In the early days, when there was like 10 games, it felt fine. The bare bones presentation felt like a placeholder. But then it never really changed. More and more games were added, but the eShop just stayed the same, slowly buckling from the crushing weight of thousands upon thousands of garbage games. Hey, Nintendo, do you remember when the entire video game industry crashed because of shoddy games? You know, like that crash you helped save the industry from with the whole Nintendo Seal quality thing, limiting who could publish on your platforms in an effort to stop bad games from poisoning the whole system? Well, we could really use some of that spirit with the eShop. If there isn't some baseline quality control efforts, great indie developers will continue to watch their games get buried under piles of Unreal Engine asset cash grabs. Emulation on the Switch is kind of a mess. And I don't mean that in a sense that it's like bad, I mean that it's literally messy. It feels like a disorganized pile of different sized rectangles with no easily glanceable labels, like just thrown on the screen. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the detailed box art, and I think Nintendo's whole Netflix of retro game strategy is pretty good, allowing people to bounce around and sample games without having to buy every single one. But I'm spoiled by emulator front ends. I love organizing my retro collections and admiring box art and details just at a glance. You can sort of organize your collections in the Nintendo front end manually, or you can like sort them by date and title and that sort of thing. But when you do it manually, every time new games are added, your organization just goes right out the window. And no matter what, everything just feels kind of difficult to parse and navigate. Plus, every system is its own game in the Switch, which is feeling awful clunky now that there are 5 separate systems floating around. One slick, coherent retro game interface would really go a long way, and there are a ton of front ends out there showing Nintendo how it can be done. So enough about the retro game interface, what about the emulation itself? I know the quality of emulation has been fairly criticized over the years, especially with the Nintendo 64, but they've been slowly, steadily making improvements. So it's not the emulation itself that bothers me. No, it's the borders. Why can't I turn off this pattern? Why do I have a bright icon in the corner? And why will these menu options on the bottom never disappear? With OLED burn-in on TVs, this could be a big problem, even if the OLED switch itself is, impervious to that sort of thing. But more than that, it's just distracting, especially when those elements are brighter than the game itself. The Switch has a D-pad problem. Outside the Switch Lite, it just doesn't really have one. Okay, so Hori is an official D-pad Joy-Con accessory, but it's kinda ugly and the D-pad is still placed in a weird spot, so it's not the best experience. It's odd that Nintendo, a company who defined the perfect D-pad with the Super Nintendo, has struggled so much this generation. Even my two Pro controllers from the early years of the Switch have all sorts of problems with their D-pad. They constantly register false presses, which is a big problem in games like Tears of the Kingdom that use it regularly. Personally, my favorite controller for the Switch is the 8BitO Pro 2 controller, which has a flawless D-pad in the perfect spot. I just really wish Nintendo had a proper first-party D-pad focused Joy-Con for use in handheld mode that, was better than the Hori one. And no, using the NES controller like a Joy-Con doesn't count. Even though it is kind of cool that this actually works. I got a whole short about that. Account support across multiple Switches is something that I guess has technically gotten better over the years, but it has not gone nearly far enough. I've been installing Steam and playing my library on more PCs than I could count, yet Nintendo is still taking the tiniest of baby steps in letting us use multiple machines with the same account. I would love to have a Switch Lite on the go and leave my OLED at home, but I'm not dealing with all the hurdles that requires, registering secondary systems that always have to have an online connection to verify ownership of digital titles, and even just switching, no pun intended, once from my original Switch to the OLED felt needlessly perilous. This is just one part of the experience. I'm really hoping Nintendo addresses with the new generation because there's so much room for improvement here. So despite me spending an entire video basically complaining about the Nintendo Switch, none of this is to say that I don't like it. In fact, I love the Nintendo Switch. If there was one system I had to pick for a desert island, this would be the one I'm taking with me. So many of my favorite games are on this system, and the hardware and form factor is just so much fun to play and just so useful. I like playing local multiplayer games, and everything about the system is built to make that possible. It's awesome. So what do you think? What has been something about the Switch that you thought for sure would be updated by now that just hasn't changed? What are some things that are on your wish list for the Switch 2 or whatever it ends up being called? I know I cannot wait to find out what Nintendo has up its sleeve. And I know some of you are probably already typing in the comments that a whole desert island thing that you would have like a Steam Deck or a PC or something that could emulate the Switch, but in this totally made up scenario about the desert island, you're not allowed to do that, and I say so I'm going to take the Switch.